fun. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. 1, show why the kind of policies we get are better. 2, show why they're more likely to be successful. And 3, show how local benefits can scale up in order to prevent climate change as a whole. Before that, some framing. First of all, being pro-environment and the status quo is a very bipartisan thing, right? Conservative ideas of protecting the homeland exist. At the same time, we have sort of liberal ideas of a responsibility to the planet and other beings that are on it. The problem is when it's a global thing, this narrative often becomes dominated by one of those ideologies, right? So for example, when it's dominated by specific people or ideologies like Greta Thunberg, idea of sort of more liberal or vegan and pro-environmentalism, it means that people and the narrative that's associated with them becomes controversial. When we have more local movements, we can have diverse narratives and people that are more popular among the local populations, right? So this probably looks like Native Americans using a separate ideology in order to protect their environment, or local conservatives appealing to the idea of protecting their homeland. Secondly, this motion is going forward. So a lot of liberal people already think climate change exists and want to do something about it. The people we need to convince and that this motion is about are those that are currently don't buy into the environmental movement. And these are often centrists or conservatives who don't like the global liberal agenda. I'll take the clarification in a second. Secondly, I think they're more likely to buy in at the point when we have local movements that are suited to them. Okay, clarification, go ahead.
What is the counterfactual? How does fighting climate change look exactly? What kind of policies are we talking?
Yeah, cool. That's what I'm literally getting to now. So what does this look like? I think it means things like focusing on local pollution of a river, things like the Ganges in India, which is incredibly polluted, rather than macro level abstract climate change, right? This can also look like things like hurricane prevention in the US, which of course is part of the larger problem of climate change, but you're focusing more on local issues that affect people. There's some level of overlap here, obviously. For example, you can explain climate change using local phenomena, so things like heat waves in India or rising sea levels in the Maldives, but the focus is still on local harm. So you're going to try and address local harms in the first place before aiming for things like global agreements, for example. Also means that the policy-making agenda is probably going to happen on a local country or like county level rather than on a global scale. Okay, moving on then to why the kind of policies we get are better. Firstly, they have more specific aims that politicians can be held accountable for. The global agenda against climate change is often abstract, right? The impact only takes effect years later. There's not really much you can see as to how it's being effective. With local aims and local specific agendas, you can see those impacts immediately and hold politicians accountable. Secondly, they show the immediate impact for people, which often creates hope and means they're more likely to campaign or think that future changes are possible. The current narrative for most people is, I can't do anything anyway because the problem of climate change is so big. What we do by focusing on local problems is we break it down to things that people can actually tackle and local agendas that they can follow. Thirdly, local people have more information about the ways climate change affects them, right? So local groups in Brazil or the Amazon know more about what is best for the environment there. This cannot be captured by global policies that are meant to work everywhere. Finally, I think it means we can use diverse approaches. Some people might go vegan, and that might be sort of a liberal agenda that we have in a lot of Western countries. Others might fight for better animal farming to reduce the sort of CO2 impact of that. I think the diversity of approaches is more likely to be successful because the problem is in the status quo, not everyone can follow these global narratives, right? Not everyone can go vegan or stop driving a car. If there's no public transport in your local area, that's impossible for you. We make it easier to opt into pro-environment policies at the point at which we focus on those local agendas and create less guilt for not implementing that global agenda, but instead it's your local group telling you, you are doing your best, you should do this specific thing that you can do there. I think this is also true on a country level, because for some countries, solution might be solar energy, right? So for the Middle East, for example, where there's a lot of direct sunlight, for others it might be water or nuclear energy. You shouldn't prescribe from a global level what the best solution is. Secondly then, why are these policies more likely to be successful and to be implemented in the first place? I think firstly, local change is just far easier to achieve. As the environmental movement, you have closer connections to policymakers and local businesses, which means it's easier to explain to them how pollution is affecting the local community and how you should go about changing that. Secondly, I think it's far less likely that you get backlash because one global movement will be dominated by Western countries or people from the West. Often what happens in developing countries is there's a backlash against this because people think you're not understanding our local context. You don't understand the challenges we're facing and the fact that we need to develop and need to pollute in some way to do that. But this applies even in developed countries, right? At the point at which you tell conservatives you can protect your landscape by doing this policy, rather than saying you have to buy into climate change and the liberal agenda, I think you're far more likely to get this change. Okay, why is the global agenda unlikely to be successful? And note that opposition explicitly has to engage with this. 3 mechanisms. Firstly, there's often veto power, right? So in international bodies like the European Union or the UN, you often have consensus decision-making, which means that one person can hold up an entire agreement. It means that you make very little progress. Secondly, even if there's no veto power, there's often a diversity of interests, which means that local political pressures in some countries like Germany that don't want to use nuclear energy means you're likely to get sort of watered down agreements in that sense that represent the lowest possible consensus and not the kind of other things that countries could do. Thirdly, you don't make concessions because climate-friendly policies often make you less competitive and harm your economy. This often looks like bargaining that happens where you're like, oh, but we want to protect our steel sector or our car industry, so we're not going to do that. What happens if you have local level issues that people focus on, like the pollution of the Ganges in India? You're far more likely to make those economic concessions because you see the symbolism that's attached to those local conditions and that they're important to your people. I think this means that sort of harms to other, like often you're not willing to concede these harms when they only affect other countries. Most importantly, though, why do these benefits scale up? Because opposition is probably going to stand up here and say climate change needs to be solved on a global level because it's so big. Firstly, it scales up because it creates competition. At the point at which you have some pressure in regions that move forward, like in California, where there's a lot more environmental policies, it creates more pressure for other regions, countries to follow that path and to also show that they're doing something for the environment. Secondly, it also demonstrates the successful impact of policies in combating climate change, i.e., if one region does this successfully, others might follow. It basically sets a precedent. And finally, it convinces people who previously were unconvinced by the narrative that you can be successful to do this and that it can actually happen without big economic impacts. For all of those reasons, we think we get broader buy-in, but opening up.
Hear, hear. Thank that speaker for their remarks and invite the leader of the opposition to open up the opening case. Hear, hear.
Assuming I'm audible?
Yep, you're good.
All right. Starting in a second. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to make 2 major constructive points in my speech. Firstly, why we are better capable of helping the environment in general. And secondly, we have more strength and a better capacity to convince people to fight global warming. But first, let's abstract from all this and consider the implications of this. Sure, it may be fine to fight local problems in terms of pollutions, but this on its own is never enough in terms of impact to offset all the horrible consequences that global warming will have upon the world. Because this is an issue that we have not seen before. This is an issue that will affect every single person on the planet, and not only this generation, but the generations to follow, which means that it is not an issue that can be tackled individually, but requires cooperation between different organizations with their own expertise, human, political, and economical capital. And this is what we stand on the side of the opposition. We think our global agenda will look something like fighting for consensus decisions and cooperations to tax corporations, to limit pollution, for example, to have taxation on old cars, on planes. We will also have quotas for pollution. But most importantly, aside from that, we think that this global agenda requires us to focus on our attention on specific areas in the world that disproportionately produce more pollution than others, and that sabotage the nature and the natural environment in a way that affects other regions within the world. We think this is primarily done in developing nations, in which through institutional reasons as well as governmental institutions, we don't have as much accountability, and this is where the majority of pollution comes in the status quo. So let's begin with our constructive. Firstly, why do we think we have a better capacity to help the environment? We think that firstly, local problems don't appear, local problems especially noticed as most environmental organizations are centered, created and function within Western democracies are not as grave. They're not as grave because those problems exist within a framework that is most likely a social democracy with regulations on labor, regulations on pollution to the environment, and also they have get more time, technology, and capital to solve any environmental problems that they may have had, which means that the vast majority of pollution and the vast majority of environmental problems that pollute local environments and trickle down to the rest of the world actually are happening in the developing world. We think that secondly, the process of making some actual change, it's much harder on a local level in terms of the Western world, because you have to fight against corporations with huge amounts of economical and political stake. Compare this to fighting specific instances of pollution in the developing world, which are not happening in the hands of people who are representing corporations who have huge economical stake, but are actually happening because poor people are chopping down forests and poor people are polluting nature because they just want to make a living out of themselves. This is a problem that is much easier to solve and it is much better on our side. But thirdly, I want to talk about bureaucracy, because opening government says that it's much easier to solve local problems, but there's still some obstacles to solving local problems in terms of having to deal with governmental bureaucracy, resistance from corporations. We think that when you are fighting global problems that are interconnected and affect everybody, actors are willing to allow you to solve them more easily. And we think this is impactful at the point in which you are more capable of solving bigger problems that disproportionately affect the most vulnerable people and affect more people compared to local problems. But second point of constructive, why we think we're better capable of fighting global change in terms of cooperation between different environmental organizations. We think that firstly, just the cooperation in itself brings us a higher capacity of capital for change. That is human capital, social capital, and this comes not only in the form of people willing to do actions and people having the money to solve specific problems that disproportionately bring more pollution to the world, but we're also talking about experience and tactics and how different environmental organizations with their own tactics can share experience in tackling specific problems. Now, this is where we disagree with the side of the opening government. We don't think that necessarily different environmental organizations cooperating on global problems will lead to them losing their individuality in their own way. We think that rather we could have cooperation and discussion of different ideas and approaches so that we can better understand the problems and better solve them. But secondly, I think we're more capable of solving those problems in terms of action from environmental agency, because we're better capable of giving a narrative that actually slays people. Because at the point in which that firstly, we consider global warming an event that is so catastrophic, that is so dire, that it would affect everybody personally, this is the point in which you have a better capacity to change the will of the people, because the first instinct that each person has is self-preservation. At the point in which a person feels that in the near future, they or their children and the people they care about will be personally affected, this is the point in which you can slay them to move in a direction that is cooperating with the agenda of those environmental agencies. And this is exactly the opposite on the side of the opening government, and I will explain so in a second. Before that, I will take a point from closing.
Despite all this rhetoric, in the past many years, we've seen every month being hotter than the last. Why is your approach likely to be successful if it's status quo and failing?
Just because in the status quo we have been failing and the past has been bad, this doesn't negate all the mechanisms I just gave you. I don't understand what is the logical point of this question. Anyway, so the comparison is this. People are feel personally affected on our side, while on the other side, they feel as if the problems are not as vast because they're portrayed as local problems that can be solved easily, and they're not huge in scope. But the second mechanism is just talking about the magnitude, because what affects people is not only that they will be personally affected, but it is also fear. Negative emotions, as we're wired to experience more intensely negative emotions, is what pushes people to action. At the point in which we portray global warming as something that requires the whole world to come together, something that requires a huge amount of cooperation in the resources, this is the point in which you portray the problem as more serious, as more catastrophic, and this is the point in which you portray it as something to be feared and something to be frightened of. This is the point in which you're actually willing to engage more people because they realize the scope of the problem and they actually fear. And fear is what drives people towards change. If you want change that is not limited to local instances and you want to solve global warming, vote opening opposition.
Here, I think that's speaker for the remarks and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for side government. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, cool. Give me one sec. Okay. Starting off. Okay, cool. Starting off in 3, 2, 1. The agreements in Kyoto, the agreements in Paris. Every single time we've tried to do something which combats the global nature of this climate change, all we get are watered down and meaningless agreements which people can very easily opt out of and which aren't binding and only manifest really in the super long term. Louisa gave you that analysis. She proved why even in the best case of opening opposition, if you still get buy-in, why that's unlikely to have any success. Unfortunately, it wasn't responded to and they're literally already losing this debate. 3 things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about what the environmental movement looks like. Secondly, I'm going to talk about individuals who buy in. And lastly, I'm going to talk about like macro governmental level responses in terms of companies and also governments. Firstly, what does the environmental movement look like? I think that their side of the house is a side that emphasizes global level changes in the environment. What does this have implications on? Firstly, it means you focus on statistics a lot more because the impact of climate change is still going to manifest in its most extreme form a lot later on, which means that currently what you need to do is try and demonstrate the harms of this in terms of statistics, etc. Secondly, it's necessarily more abstract, and that means you have to focus on like the sort of rhetoric that opening opposition themselves give about how grave the issue is, and you kind of need to use words to make up for this. Thirdly, I think it's oftentimes dominated by the extreme sorts of things in terms of climate change as being like an existential risk for the reasons that they say, which means the environmental movement demands ridiculously high things from individuals because they think that you should allow to do whatever it takes necessarily in order to combat climate change, and that places extremely high demand on individuals who are probably unlikely or even unable in many cases to actually go through on that. That's the analysis that Louisa gives you, which gets no response. The comparative is that local pollution is something that gets focused on. I think what this means is a few different things. Firstly, it means a more focus on individual stories because local pollution directly affects people, you know, in and of itself, so you can then amplify their own voices. That means you get more empathy because it's obviously a current impact which exists. But secondly, I think it's probably more diverse and diffuse as an environmental movement because each environmental movement does focus on its own local area and the harms of pollution that exist. What we get a pushback on this from OO is they say, oh no, but local pollution is not a problem. I'm sorry, this is just incredibly ignorant. Like the pollution of things like river sources that exist that mean that fishermen aren't able to fish anymore and gain a sense of livelihood. These are incredibly grave problems that exist. And I think it's very flippant for opening opposition to just say that these things aren't problems and won't motivate people without proving why. I think oftentimes they are things that motivate people. I think people often have a strong sense of attachment to the places in which they live, for example, and they will want to ensure that those sorts of things get maintained in the long run. I think that is just a glib assertion coming out of opening opposition. Before I talk about who's going to buy into the movement now, closing.
Which is more likely to get structural binding change on China as a polluter? When we say everyone else is doing their part, or when we say China just sing kumbaya and do it by yourself?
the problem is proving that everyone else is going to do their part in the first place. And I think it's unlikely that you're going to get this. But also secondly, insofar as the China like focus on its own internal stability and oftentimes doesn't want foreign intervention from other groups, I would say focusing on the harms that exist directly to China are going to be successful. Yeah. Okay, on who buys into the movement now. I think the key bit of framing here is that this round is not a retrospective debate. It exists going forward, as Louisa says. What that means is that there's often already a awareness of climate change. Like people are aware of climate change that exists because the movement has already emphasized this. What that means is that the people who would buy in and would be motivated by statistics, etc., probably have already bought in the first place. And the people we need to get on side now are two sorts of groups. Firstly, the sorts of people who disagree with the current movement for different reasons because they think it's a political project or whatever. Or secondly, in countries that don't have movements to begin with. I think that we get both groups on our side of the house. Why? Firstly, because local appeal is likely to work. When you focus on this in terms of the implications they exist directly, you're generally going to get them on their side. Secondly, you give them a sense of empowerment because you think that you can actually do things to combat the harms that exist. Thirdly, I think that means that you actually can focus on specific things that are culturally important to the local group. You can focus on the Ganges in India, which is seen as, like an incarnation of God, for example. That's probably going to mean that people buy in overall. I would posit that this is a trade-off and this can't happen on their side of the house. Because on their side of the house, at best, all that you get is like some focus on statistics or whatever and emphasizing the graveness of the problem overall without tailoring things towards the local issues which exist, because oftentimes, as opening opposition's own analysis suggests, it's going to be dominated by Western movements who are unable to understand the nuance of these areas. I think that we also get new movements because they can then mobilize over the specific local harms that exist as a result of this. The weighing here and the impact are firstly, that more people buy into environmentalism overall, but crucially, I think this is a much more important impact than the long-run abstract change that you get from opening opposition's best case, which is like governmental agreements, because on our side of the house, you at least get immediate change, which is really important because insofar as climate change is reaching a turning point, we need to do whatever it takes at the moment. So if their impact only exists in the long run, that's probably already too late for them to claim any sorts of benefits in the round. So insofar as you get more buy-in, and that's the most important consideration in the round, we're already winning this debate. Secondly, lastly, then talking about like governments and companies. The opening opposition's first claim is that companies won't support like local pollution, but they will support things like global agreements. I think this is just trivially untrue because the biggest companies obviously are threatened by a global agreement which says, like Shell or whatever, that you need to decarbonize completely and stop using fossil fuels, for example. Those are probably the sorts of things that you're going to directly lobby against. But these sorts of companies, insofar as they want to appear as environmentally useful, they probably are going to allow themselves to do things like, not polluting the local area if there's demand for that. That's at least changes that companies are able to make. Whereas on their side of the house, in their best case scenario of these sorts of agreements, companies are always going to oppose this for the reason that that threatens their direct business model. So actually, I think we're more likely to get company cooperation on our side of the house. But secondly, what they say is that actually there's more social and political capital in the West, and we can use this to create global change. I just don't think this is necessarily true. Like there's some capital or awareness of the environment. That doesn't mean that you have awareness of how specifically to protect things like rainforests, for instance, compared to the local population in the area who have lived there for generations. I think the last thing they say is the narrative is a lot more likely to persuade people because you emphasize the graveness of the threat. I'd observe I've already shown that we can already get a grave threat on our side of the house. The delta at that point then is that we can show we actually get a meaningful change and meaningful solvency for this problem. You can show that the things like the Ganges have become a lot less polluted over time, but you can't show that climate change is dissipated or whatever because the impacts of that only exist in the super long term. So even in their best case scenario of like emphasizing how big the problem is, that's probably only likely to lead to paralysis overall. So I think what that means is that people probably aren't going to be motivated and governments themselves are unlikely to agree on actual global solutions, and they're likely to be incredibly watered down. But at the very least, you get individual level changes and regional level changes, which can to some extent combat this climate change. And for that reason, I am proud to propose.
Hear, hear. I think that's eager for the remarks, and invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to finish off the front half. Hear, hear.
I am audible. This is not a question, this is a statement. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. But no, I think it is the opening government that is ignorant at the point where they claim that climate change is this fucking boogeyman that doesn't exist for 50 years and then it appears and takes everyone's lives. Climate change is happening right now. It has visible effects that we can like fight against. It has visible effects which we can point to the people. Firstly, on the point that we cannot claim any benefits because we probably won't solve climate change anyways. We aren't saying that we're going to absolutely solve all of climate change. What we're saying is we can massively diminish it. Buying 100 years for the planet is a really, really big impact. Even if we can't ultimately save the entire planet, we can massively increase the amount of like time it takes for climate change to reach the final point where it kills everyone. I think it is intuitive that this impact exists. Secondly, say, but we can't attract people because climate change is abstract. 4 responses to this. Firstly, notice that so are local things, right? Insofar as maybe a river gets polluted, but it doesn't change its fucking color, right? It still looks the same. You still need to use statistics and things like this to convince people, higher cancer rates, higher rates of fucking magnesium or whatever. You still need to access abstract points in order to convince people that this thing is happening. We don't see why this is unique. Secondly, notice that even if these problems are not abstract, they're often much smaller and affect far fewer people. Even if, even if a pollution of a river happens, only so many people live around this river. Only so many people will be affected by its waters and things like this. The majority of people, not only across the world, but also within the country itself, literally don't get affected by this, right? This is a very local problem that affects only local people, and notice there's a very limited amount of local people. Thirdly, notice climate change is absolutely not abstract, because it might be like abstract in the form of, what will happen in the future, but enough people know that climate change is a thing to where it is not an impossible thing to convince them that they need to do something about climate change. Notice OG themselves consent to this. They say, yes, people know about climate change. Look at the asymmetry. We need to convince them how to solve climate change. We need to generate, we need to use rhetoric that convinces them climate change is a major problem and to show them precisely how to solve them. But fourthly, notice, often we don't have to necessarily just solve climate change, but we can also mitigate the effects of climate change. A global agenda would also consist of helping people who are affected by rising sea levels. This is another example of a global agenda. And these are very material changes, right? This can be manifested and seen in the real world. We don't need to necessarily be abstract all the time. We can help real people, right? Secondly, they say, but local people are better at solving the problems. Let's let Saudi Arabia solve their own problems. Firstly, this is probably what CEO might want to run, but notice we already ran it in first speech. A lot of those countries don't have major environmental movements that have power, right? Firstly, a lot of environmental movements are West-centric, meaning because that is where the richest people are, that is where the highest capacity for caring about these things are, meaning that if we do this policy, countries that don't have these kinds of movements are literally left out to fucking dry, right? But secondly, a lot of those countries cannot be pressured simply by a local movement. No local movement will be powerful enough to pressure the country. What is the asymmetry? Two things. Firstly, multiple movements across the world pressuring this country, or two, movements convincing different countries that now pressure this country, right? Things like the Paris Accords, right? Or things like major agreements in the United Nations for environment and things like this. This is the only capacity in which we solve the problems in the developing countries. But secondly, again, we literally said this, right? Local movements can still play a part in this global agenda. They can still give advice as to what is the best way to fight it in these specific areas. The expertise that they're talking about and the difference in approach can still be accessed. Movements are rational. They aren't just going to use the same approach for everything. This just doesn't make sense. Then they say, but we can affect politicians more in this capacity. Notice there is a very simple reason why we cannot. If local pollution happens, we cannot convince politicians to fix it because that would admit that politicians fucked up in the first place, right? On the alternative, at a point, we don't say this is your fault. We say this is the people's fault, and politicians have much greater capital to say this is the problem because it isn't directly their own fault. Notice that often the only people who can solve local pollution are the very people who created it, right? I don't understand how this impact works. Then they say the global agenda will fail. Why? Firstly, one country can just hold up everything because the European Union works on a unanimous thing. One, this is an absolute assertion. I think very few organizations actually work like this. The UN does not work like this. This doesn't work. But secondly, this is absolutely true on a local level. Often many city councils and things like this, which are the ones to solve local pollution also work on a consensus base. Also, if one person just decides, oh no, I don't want to solve this, you still are fucked, right? You still cannot solve shit. You still cannot generate change. But secondly, notice on our side, it's substantially more likely that you won't need governmental support to solve climate change, because a lot of solvency for climate change is within people's power themselves. It is to stop littering, it is to go vegan, it is to do all these kinds of things. Solving local pollution almost always requires governmental intervention. It almost always requires either regulation or like to literally go and like clean it up, right? On our side, you're substantially less likely to need these flawed political systems in order to generate change. Before I go on CG.
As the average person who probably knows something about climate change, am I more likely to care about the homeless person who's dying of pollution in New Delhi or the child who is dying of drought in Africa?
I'm sorry, I am not, like, I don't understand what's the comparative, which is local, which is not local, but in general, like, I don't know, I'm not sure. You are likely to care about what will happen to you. And if pollution is not going to affect you, but the drought might affect you, because guess what? Soon the temperature will rise in your country as well. You're substantially more likely to care. I don't know how you weigh little kid in Africa versus little kid in India, but you weigh your own interests above everything else. So this is how you care more about climate change. Then they say, countries don't care about each other. There isn't likely for change to be generated. Firstly, absolutely yes, they do, especially when this is a global thing that can affect all countries. But secondly, notice that on our side, we can generate a thing where countries pressure other countries into making changes, right? Into taking a global agenda. Notice, many countries stand behind this global agenda. We are not alone. This is, again, Paris Accords. This is all these kinds of things where multiple countries exist. All we can do is showcase a way in which this can be solved, and then we can influence whether countries are going to attack. In problems of local pollution, other countries definitely don't care, right? Literally, major countries don't give a fuck if there is a local pollution in India or whatever. There's actually more likely it's a global problem affecting everything. Finally, say, but movements will always want too much. This is just one-line rebuttal. Movements are rational. On both sides of the house, they are likely to have some idea of what would be too much, of what would be too much to require for people, and what would be sensible goals that they can achieve. So to a large extent, I think movements on either side will require what they believe is most likely for people to succeed. On our side, people can actually do it because it doesn't require local government to pick shit. This is the difference, both us.
You're here. Okay, I think that's it for the remarks, and invite the member of government to open up the back half of the debate. Here.
Audible?
Yep, you're good.
All right, cool. Give me a second. Beginning my speech for 3, 2, 1. And I think the largest problem with international environmental agencies or any kinds of environmental movements is such that they don't take into consideration the specific nuance and niche interests and priorities of people on the ground, specifically the most vulnerable, and take that into their calculations when trying to enact things like environmental changes and environmental campaigns. The problem of this is that insofar as these environmental movements don't ensure that pushes for green efforts cohere and necessarily align with the particular interests of people on the ground, to the extent that individuals on the ground are able to then see that green efforts can exist simultaneously together with their own other kinds of priorities, is when these environmental movements are then likely to fail, right? Because in the absence of any form of ability to make these two things cohere, is when individuals on the ground therefore opt out, is when, for instance, people don't feel apathetic towards the environmental situation. And even if they knew about the extent of environmental damage, they are unlikely to want to do anything about it, simply because they are just unlikely to want to give up the other kinds of priorities in their lives that they don't feel should be put down in favor of environmental sustainability. A few arguments for us today. First, how we reduce the sufferings of the underprivileged. Second, how proximity affects priorities and moral obligations. And third, why the counterfactual is far more effective in our work. Before that, let's want to really take our opening opposition in 2 ways. The first thing they tell us is that their main benefit is that, well, basically individuals on the ground realize the full extent of the problem. I think I have 3 responses to this. The first, that people who do have the privilege to participate in green efforts probably already have access to things like education and public awareness for them to understand the concerns and scope of environmental damage anyway, which we therefore think awareness is not a unique benefit in OO's model. But second, just because people are aware of the scale of environmental damage does not necessarily spur them into action to push for green efforts on their own. They are likely to then, a good majority of them are likely to just be like, well, sure, it may be a bad thing, but just because it doesn't concern me right now, I don't particularly care. And even if it did, I think I have greater concerns to deal with at the moment. The third is that the mechanism in manifesting the scale of environmental problem in opening of this world is likely to only exist at the top in terms of political agreements and conventions, which oftentimes are easily blindsided by people and corporations on the ground who don't really feel the need to care about, or at least it's something they ought to prioritize over other incentives they might have, such as money and making a living. The second thing is that we have to note that the Paris Accords and like all these kind of carbon tax conventions are oftentimes, even if they are successful, require large periods of time to have to benefit and to actually accrue some degree of change. Therefore, the only individuals who are likely to benefit from these kinds of things or these kinds of agreements and like long-term conventions and agreements are likely going to be people in the future who have not yet been born. We think on a very fundamental level, we ought to prioritize, and when it comes to a trade-off, we ought to prioritize the individuals living in the present right now, which means doing things like, for instance, engaging them on a grassroots level, dealing with their unique problems, such as, for instance, repairing their water supply in their local village, for instance, because these are the individuals we ought to prioritize more, because their harm and their suffering is something that is material and is something that is confirmed, it's something that is definite. Whereas any kinds of potential benefit that can accrue from this kind of long-term agreements are not going to affect the people on the ground right now, but rather are only going to benefit the individuals in the future. It is unclear to me why then, in this trade-off, we ought to just ignore the people on the ground right now who are actually suffering from material harms, and we know for certain are actually suffering because of these kinds of problems of environmental damage. We think that ultimately the trade-off is simple here. We're happy to trade off international outreach for deeper and stronger impact within our environment, such as doing things like engaging in talks with city mayors, local businesses, mom and pop shops, and like changing the lifestyles of like civilians on the ground, because these are things that impact the most vulnerable and individuals, right? And we think furthermore that Western powers, like currently, this all set up, had Germanized international talks on environmental efforts on the status quo. Anyway, this looks like, for instance, Western powers like France as well as Italy, and in fact, especially in Scandinavian countries, who oftentimes use things like innovations and tech to try and solve environmental problems, and oftentimes tend to use poorer countries like Delhi in India, usually as like test subjects as well as test arenas to see whether their innovations particularly work. We think that these discussions surrounding climate change are either A, going to be locked out at the top, or B, are just going to be seen as things on the people on the ground that they just don't need to care about, right? So we think ultimately, because different countries have different priorities, we ought to then like have a nuanced approach in dealing with the situation. The first argument then is how we reduce the sufferings of the underprivileged. We think the problem under status quo is that environmental movements that spread global objectives find themselves often unrelatable to citizens of different countries, and it's not that these citizens don't have a green goal in mind, it's that their circumstances and environment are simply not suited to facilitating working towards this goal. This looks like, for instance, a citizen from Malang in East Java whose entire livelihood is circulated around traditional methods of farming that involves burning down plantations to create fertile ground. This is the kind of individual that simply can't relate to global pushes, especially because the priority set of this particular individual may not necessarily align and cohere to international pushes of things like introducing carbon tax emissions. Especially these pushes are in contradiction to what is like an individual may prioritize, because doing so necessarily mean that his life, that he has to give up his own livelihood, or at the very least is to negatively affect it, right? This is at a point in time where even in the very best case scenario where these pushes are somewhat effective, it's unclear why the incentive structures of the individuals suddenly change and they want to suddenly opt in all of a sudden, right? And we therefore think that like when you talk about countries like Delhi with like suffer from things like bad air pollution, where air quality is always like incredibly low, we think that you ignore the niche problems of these countries when you approach it from an international and large scale, right? We think that the pollution in Delhi caused by the burning of crops specifically from a particular area in Delhi, just like how farmers in Indonesia do the same thing during farming seasons, therefore creating massive amounts of haze that drifts towards neighboring countries like Singapore, are all things that necessarily have to be dealt with on a very fundamental grassroots level, right? And we think the poorest of the poor and the most vulnerable get like messed up and get hurt in these kinds of problems that require grassroots approaches, which has two impacts. The first is that when these environmental movements do enact changes as per prioritizing the global agenda, it makes these agendas alien and unrelatable to most of them, right? And the worst case is that essentially you just turn this area around, these individuals away, because they just don't know why they ought to care about these kinds of things like the Kyoto Protocol. But the second is that you turn away these individuals from participating in green efforts also because your international conventions and laws are likely to come in contradiction to the poorest of the poor, who don't have the privilege to access things like reusable cups or metal straws. But yet these are the very same individuals that are likely to be punished as a result of these kinds of international conventions. Before I move on, I'd like to take a POI from opening.
Climate change right now, not in 20 years, is causing people to be displaced, yes, people to die from hunger because they cannot farm. How can you claim that these people are unsympathetic and that you cannot convince people to care about them?
because the trade-off that you offer is a change in their lifestyle that necessarily is in contradiction to their greater priorities in life. We therefore think that when you apply a large, broad brush approach to these individuals without catering to their nuanced interests is when they get turned away from participating in your global platforms in the first place. Second, why is the counterfactual more effective? We think it's not just about knowing that the policymakers or owners of businesses, as OG suggests, recognize the problems on the ground, but more important is also about understanding the lay of the land, understanding and knowing what are the problems that are unique to these places on a grassroots level. Because we recognize, we argue to you that going down to a farming village in Indonesia and introducing things like more sustainable ways of living and conducting their farming, as opposed to traditional slash and burn methods, instead of applying things like carbon taxing from the top, is also going to be incredibly important. This also looks like, for instance, going down to a neighborhood in Malaysia and educating the citizens on the benefits of using more sustainable ways of connecting their lives, such as bring their own lunch boxes when they take food away. The reason why grassroots level efforts are just that much more impactful is because they have a greater opt-in from these neighborhood campaigns, which are likely to show on a step-by-step basis and a personal basis how citizens can allow green efforts to cohere and acclimatize with their own other incentives, which then makes green campaigns that much more palatable and sustainable in the long term moving forward. We think that ultimately a grassroots on the ground effort allows for greater opt-in and allows for a greater awareness for individuals to then be more welcome to green efforts, because these green efforts don't necessarily contribute to the greater priorities in life. We cannot be proud to stand on closing.
Here. Okay, I think that's here for the remarks, and invite the member of opposition to open up the CO case. Here.
Yeah, am I audible and visible?
Yeah, you're good.
Great. I prefer my POIs in the chat. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. Panel, 2 important recharacterizations. First of all, we don't need to accept what OG tried pushing on us, that our movement will focus only on stats and figures. We think it's incredibly pertinent, and even more on our side, that we get to use instrumentalist stories from anywhere in the world to put on our right? People in the middle of the US who aren't really affected by rising sea levels, being able to look at photos of a village in Maldives, which has been submerged, and then relate to these problems. What this means is that areas where we do not have pertinent problems related to climate change still get some sort of buy-in because they can see how it directly affects someone else. Second piece of characterization, global movements can have a toolbox of methods. We aren't pushing for something like, oh, look, just because you're a global movement, it means you have one major thing you're pushing for, right? We completely believe in the fact that global movements can have different tools in their toolbox which they can advocate for people in different situations, right? Moreover, we think this is even more powerful because it allows resource sharing and people from different areas which face the same problems to band together and come to solutions. Let's talk about slash and burn, which the previous speaker spoke about, right? This problem will never get solved in rural Indonesia because the farmers don't know what to do about it. This problem will never get solved in Haryana on the borders of Delhi because the rural farmers don't know what to do about it. When these farmers band together across the world, everyone relates to having the same problem. This is the only way you get some sort of technology transfer. People who have figured out a solution to the problem, sustainable methods of farming, which do not require them to burn down the fields every season and while at the same time destroying their soil fertility, we see that this is the only way we get actual tangible change, right? Moving on, what am I going to do in this speech? 2 extensions, right? First off, on why global gets more traction, because this is an important make that opening has missed out. We completely forgot to tell you why going global will get more traction. That is important. We fill that in. And second, why local movements are completely useless. And even if we buy in everything they tell us about why there's an incentive of local people to change and become more climate friendly, they simply have no ability to do so. But before that, some extraneous rebuttal, right? CG, who's very derivative of OG, spoke about two main things, right? First of all, on minorities, on the poor, right? Panel note, they're likely to be sidelined on their side of the house on local movements where they do not have any political capital to make any sort of change, right? On our side of the house, we banned minorities across the world who face the same problems and get them solutions on a broader scale, right? What does this look like? This looks like people who are suffering from pollution in the Ganges Valley, band together with people in the Amazon Valley, the Nile Valley, and all come together and think of solutions, right? We tell you that we are also likely to have more local solutions on our side of the house because it does not need to be a one-size-fits-all approach, which is the entire characterization that the government side has been trying to push on us. It does not need to be the case, right? Moving on, why does global movements get more traction, right? First of all, individual responsibility, right? When we push it on a global scale, we show you how your degradation has a tangible impact on someone somewhere in the world, right? Your guilt becomes so much more salient when you know that other people are literally dying because of your pollution and your individual efforts, right? At this point in time, when you can actually see the effects of your pollution, because the effects may not be in your area panel. When I order something from Amazon and get it shipped all the way from China to the United Kingdom, I don't care because I don't get affected by any pollution. But people who are everywhere along the track, people who get affected by rising sea levels due to aircraft emissions, all of these people get very affected by these. And this is incredibly important and can only be shown on a global scale, right? Second of all, it allows naming and shaming. It allows smaller countries to call out larger ones and smaller players to call out larger ones when they are violating climate obligations, right? Note panel, this does not exist on their side of the house, because when you expect a local sort of effort, you have no sort of cross-country comparisons that you can make, right? On our side of the house, we have things like the Paris climate change, right? When Trump accord, right? When Trump pulled out, he got severe backlash from all over the world when everyone was telling him, look, this isn't cool. You can't do this shit, right? It reached the extent where individual states in the US came up with their own policy to fit to the Paris climate change accord just because of the sort of pressure that was being developed all across the world, right? On a local frame, you simply don't have this. But see, also already mentioned, you have more fear-mongering at the point at which you can get salient examples from anywhere in the world and affect people who aren't personally affected by it in a certain situation, right? I'll take opening before I continue.
The problem with this is it misses our initial framing, because people who would be convinced by climate change have been convinced already, which means you need to appeal to the self-interest of people who see the environmental movement as global, preachy, and not really for them.
Great. So we think that the people they are trying to sort of affect have absolutely no say in the matters and in the change, right? Which leads me on to the second extension. Why, even if we accept the complete best case, it's completely useless to focus on a local point. Why? First of all, MNCs, right? Panel, this is something that people have brought up in the debate but never actually discussed, right? 95% of all global emissions are controlled or created by the top 100%, top 100 companies, right? What does this mean? This means that change has to be made at the top. The company's only answer to A, big governments, or B, their shareholders, right? And none of these can be changed on the local level. And this is incredibly important because there's no point in going and forming a protest on a local level and turning up to my local Shell drilling station and telling them, oh, look, you can't pollute my waters, because they have absolutely no say in the matter, because all they do is follow the orders that are coming from a big corporate, right? What does this actually look like on the ground? Their side of the house, they pit the people on the ground, on the local climate movement, against the people who work at the same places, right? What does this actually mean? It means that they don't get even local support, because you are putting people against their friends, against their co-workers who are presumably large parts in this thing, right? In the region. And hence they don't get this local buy-in at all. They have absolutely no way to get change on their side of the house when big lobbies can shut down these small big corporate lobbies can shut down these small localized efforts in different towns. But on our side of the house, the major change is that since we have a big global movement, we can target this at the top level, right? We can fund our own lobbies to fight for legislation, to fight for regulation at the top level. We can fight for activist investors to get in things like what's happening in Exxon right now and push for greener changes. And that's the only way that we get any change, right? But second, we think that their sort of local thing forces a sort of perception of neocolonialism onto poorer countries, right? What does this mean? It means that in recent times, all focus has been on developing countries and the pollution they've done. But all this allows us for the developed world to completely forget about all their pollution, all their climate contributions in the past 200 plus years, dating back to the Industrial Revolution, right? Making a local movement puts all the force, all the pressure on developing nations, forces them to cut back on their development, while developed nations make absolutely no changes in what they do because they aren't affected. They don't care about the cross-border linkages. They don't care about the fact that they're importing and leading to the demand, which causes this sort of problems in the developing nation. But because of all these cross-border flows, we think it's incredibly unlikely to even get any sort of change, right? So even if we take the government bets on their very best side, right, and tell you, oh, look, they have the potential to push for change on the ground, change isn't going to do anything because change simply isn't in the hands of people on the ground. Incredibly proud.
Hear, hear. Okay, I think that's your further remarks, and invite the government whip to finish off the gov side of the debate. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible and clear?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, just give me a second and then I'll start. All right, in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think the unfortunate reality of the climate change movement is that we really cannot stop the Earth very easily from getting hotter because of the massive increase in population that we see exponentially growing from like the 90s and henceforth. We think that it's really, really important to note that it's almost near to impossible to be able to stagnate the rise in global temperature that exists right now because of the ways in which people consume resources, because of the ways in which people are burdening Mother Earth, because of the ways in which people shrug individual responsibility in and of itself. What that means means is that this debate is about who can affect individuals more, and regardless of whether or not it is effective, what should environmental movements prioritize? Because at its very core, environmental movements are about making the earth more livable. They're about preserving and not being selfish in and of itself. I'm going to take out the entire op bench by providing you and repeating, in fact, a weighing mechanism that Darren already preempted in the speech in member in and of itself, right? Because on op, they talk about how being able to ensure that we have future generations that are preserved, or certain present generations in other areas that are far away from you and not as proximate to you, are something that is much better, right? We tell you that you need to be able to prioritize the current generations because one, these individuals are facing harms that are a lot more immediate and that are happening right now on a local basis. But two, that their harms are going to be far more speculative. We don't know whether we're going to colonize Mars or go to another planet or whatnot in and of itself to be able to solve the massive global problem of climate change as it currently exists. Environmental movements on their side are barely mitigating these sorts of things. But thirdly, and more importantly, we think people on the ground right now have not consented to be in the state that they are in, but they can choose to not have more children, which means that these present generations are more important than future generations. But insofar as they still talk about preserving present generations on their side, I want to clunk this op bench together and like take them down, right? The first thing that they tell you, and especially coming from closing, is that of course we can have resource sharing in our world to ensure that like people from different localities can like pool in together, because that's what a global movement necessarily looks like, right? This is very similar in mindset to the analysis that opening opposition gives you about how using statistics is something that can create an impact or a large scale change on individuals in and of itself. I'm really unsure as to why local movements that are literally taking off resources from global environmental organizations like the UNEP, like the Sustainability Development Goals of the United Nations in and of itself, which Darren characterizes to you is how the top-down approach is likely to work, are not going to have access to things like statistics or shared information across borders. Surely those are things that you can have in our world as well in and of itself. The next thing I want to do is just try to just tell you why we're different from OG, because we were very badly called out for saying that we were derivative, right? And I just don't think that that's blatantly true. The first thing that we tell you is that we provide you a mechanism which ensures that there is sustainability in the environmental movement and the people that buy into the environmental movement in our world a lot more. Because as far as op bench would like you to believe very, very strongly, nobody gives a shit that the entire world temperature has risen by 1 degree, because that's not something that creates a visceral impact as the impact of you literally seeing somebody die coughing on the streets of New Delhi because the air pollution has risen to extremely dangerous levels in and of itself. We think it's in that world wherein you are far more likely to create those visceral impacts within people in and of itself because of proximity. And this is the analysis that we give to you in member. And this is the thing that we've been trying to POI them for God knows how long, which is just the fact that proximity is what drives you to be able to change. The simplest analogy of this is that if you were walking by and you see someone drowning and you're wearing new clothes, you would still likely jump in to save that particular individual, as opposed to the moral obligation that you think you have to a dying person in Africa. Because one, that person is very, very far away from you, so you cannot relate to those problems. But secondly, and more importantly, we think that it's at a point in time when you know that you cannot solve the entire world's problems on your own, that you think that it is something that is a futile attempt. But being able to create change on a small or on a marginal basis, even if that's not true, is something that like is far more effective then, right? But secondly, we think that we are better in terms of prioritization in OG, and this is essentially CG taking over the whole opening half in general. Because the opening half debate, if you think about it, is a debate about characterizations and is a debate about effectiveness in and of itself, right? We give you two principled arguments. The first is as to why essentially we are likely or we want to care about present generations far more. But secondly, why we want to care about people who are closer to us, or why environmental movements should give a shit about people who are more proximate to them in and of itself, and why they owe them the greater moral responsibility of ensuring that they live better lives. Because the impacting that we give you in saying that these poor individuals are impacted far more in their world insofar as like the individuals who cannot afford things like air purifiers or like indoor plants, like because they're facing like massive amounts of air pollution within local areas, you are likely to get environmental movements solving those much better. But even if you aren't, we think on a principle basis that is the obligation that you owe to these individuals, because they're the ones being impacted immediately and they're the ones being impacted closer to you, and they're the ones which you can more effectively try to change. But thirdly, we give you far more mechanisms, right? Opening government simply tells you that, look, at a point in time where like you necessarily have like these international organizations being hegemonized by the West, that's a bad thing. But we tell you that the ways in which they operate is that they, one, use these developing countries as lab rats, right? They do things like innovation when it comes to like water resource allocation or like trying to solve like pollution, and that's where all of your resources and money goes. But this is not a goddamn game. People actually die within status quo, which which means that the priorities that you need to have are priorities that are likely to be more successful and less speculative, as Op Bench likes to propose to you. Let's now come to opening opposition, because opening opposition tells you a few things. The first thing that they tell you is that, of course, like Saudi Arabia and China are going to go berserk at a point in time when you say that each man on his own, right? We think that's necessarily not very different from status quo in of itself, because it's very easy for a lot of these countries to be able to sidestep things like carbon tax agreements and like literally buying carbon tax quotas from each other. The biggest MNCs, the ones that closing opposition also wants to talk about, have enough amount of resources and corporate lobbying that actually ensures that you cannot create meaningful change in their world. The difference of the delta in this debate is then on which side are you able to create more sustainable change so that people on the ground are going to be more viscerally affected in and of itself. And we think that that happens far better in our world insofar as you can boycott the corporations that actually ensure that like they are like the ones that are creating the most amount of pollution, because people start giving a shit about the environment when they know that like people who are close to them, people within their city are dying. Like the coronavirus was much worse in places with higher levels of pollution, and that was because of the environmental movement. That's how you're able to create change. But lastly, I think on complacency of politicians that they talk about, surely politicians are going to be more complacent in their world insofar as they can say, but this is just a UN mandate, like there's nothing we can do about it, insofar as we think accountability is much better in our world. But lastly, I want to talk about closing opposition's argument on neo-colonialism, right? Because they tell you that, of course, like these developing countries are necessarily going to be screwed over far more. We think that taking the onus on these developing countries and talking about the diversity that necessarily exists or the different priorities that exist within different regions means that you're able to focus a lot more, because you have a lay of the land, because you have the surveys from the people, because you have the ability to try and ensure that you're making this place more livable. At the end of this debate, you must remember, closing government wins because we prove to you that not only is it principally important for these environmental movements to prioritize these sorts of things, but it's also ensuring that like even if you aren't going to be as effective, you're going to create marginal change that's going to bring more buy-in. We're proud to propose.
You're here. Okay, I think that's good for their remarks, and invite the op whip to finish off the debate in its entirety. You're here.
Hello, can you double check that I'm audible?
Yeah, you're good.
Lovely. I prefer my POIs taken at the chat, but if I don't take it by 5:30, please feel free to verbally enunciate yourself. Right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I'm going to win this debate by structuring my speech in 3 ways. First, I'm going to talk about OG, why their solution to climate change by going local is tantamount to singing Kumbaya, but misunderstanding the real political considerations of how local politics actually works. 2, I'm going to discuss CG's bizarre extension, why this constitutes a very defeatist frame and is actually a euphemism for doing absolute jack about climate change. And third, I want to show you why both our extensions fill in both the strategic gap in our opening and the missing mechanism in our opening. So first, on the opening half deadlock, OG says the solution must embody real politics. So we must A, go local to have more political traction, and B, go local to empower minorities. OO is like, well, okay, but the solution must be structural and aspirational. No matter as to why this is the case. My first observation is that our extension proves OO's case to its fullest logical conclusion. We prove why going global increases both political currency and personal buy-in to the environmental reason. OO says people feel personally affected more on our side, but we give you 2 structural mechanisms for this. We have no response from CG. First, because personal ignorance is only overcome and pierced when guilt acquires collective proof and responsibility. We posit you are only more likely to reduce, reuse, and recycle if you know for a fact not doing so has a massive personal opportunity cost on someone else living on the planet, with rising tides destroying homes in Maldives and with pollution destroying the Ganges River. We say that we can instrumentalize the stories of other individuals and their lived realities, and that is why our movement, responding to OG's claim that it's just statistics, can fundamentally humanize the climate change movement and that of advocacy, because we can go past statistics and say, look, your actions, your ignorance, your inability to save on climate change today has a personal opportunity cost on someone living halfway across the world. So this massive cop-out on OG is massively an assertion. We can humanize stories, we do it better than OG. But second of all, the collective responsibility becomes more salient on our side. This is because it lends itself a totalizing frame, which again responds to OG's assertion on reaching out to lukewarm parties. Crucially, it's easier to neglect lukewarm parties at the point in which collective responsibility doesn't seem so totalizing and doesn't seem like it acquires a field that goes beyond merely your lived reality. And that is how we aspire lukewarm individuals to actually fight on behalf of climate change. So for these 2 structural reasons, we get more individual buy-in. But my extension speaker went a step further. He proved to you why above and beyond individual currency, it's important also to talk about macro political traction and how we change the hearts and minds of big nations. No other side was very much willing to talk about this except OO's glib analysis of saying Paris Climate Accord. So our structural mechanism for this was that we increased the capacity for naming and shaming, especially the virality of social media, especially with how geopolitics is so interconnected today. It's on our side where smaller countries can band together, like regions such as ASEAN, coming out in solidarity and accusing and calling out China for not doing enough. Note, movements don't need to be Western to the extent OG asserts, when it can be like global regional solidarity like ASEAN, especially since like 2016 where Trump pulled out and the climate change accords literally was not Western anymore. So again, I think just OG is very glib about throwing nice sounding assertions but not actually grounded in structural analysis that we prove. The conclusion of this point is that our extension uniquely proves why environmental efforts gain currency both at an individual level and on a macro political level. So therefore actualizing the benefits of OO's assertions, but dealing with the mischaracterizational frame coming from OG. The second question that I want to talk about is whether we get structural change. OG says and relies heavily on an idealistic conception of real world politics. Their first claim is that going local means A, humanizing the movement, and B, giving local people more say. I want to note here, CG has no extension to the extent it's massively derivative. They only give you examples of how going local prioritizes the anthropometric present and the lived realities of people on the ground. So I'm going to deal with this collectively by giving you two reasons why we go local. By going global, we actually go local. The first reason is because OG and CG neglect the power asymmetries that currently victimize local people. I ask, how is the Inuit community that constitutes 0.5% of the Canadian population, by the way, the most liberal democracy they have out there, the shining beacon of example, have a say in national politics when they don't have the money to campaign lobby groups? I ask how the Amazonian villagers are going to band together and have money to lobby massive MNCs out of their forests and out of their homes. Hint, they can't and they don't and they won't. So the comparative that was unresponded by CG with is that we need global solidarity, which our side gives. OG assumes that going local is a means of singing kumbaya and can somehow overcome the power asymmetries of rich lobby groups. We say they can't, and the alternative and the counterfactual reason is far more convincing, because going global gives a platform of solidarity for marginalized minorities to band together and exercise collective bargaining. And we have a track record of success, mind you, as what we saw in the UN Climate Change Conference just this year, which brought together shared concerns from minorities such as the Inuits, the Shisas, and the Orang Aslis in Malaysia. This is how we get structural global change. Before that, I'll take OG.
The consumer bases of MNCs are in the West, where they get the same kind of local pressure we talk about. The way you actually lobby them is at the point at which you have those local pressures, not if you have no movement at all and one that isn't accountable.
No, this contradicts your initial frame that you set up, that most people are ambivalent about climate change. I would suggest that paying marginally higher prices for water may be the tipping point for these individuals. And the tipping point on our side is when such movements can grow global and therefore prioritize the lived realities of like the Inuit community that you so speak of. So in going global, we give a platform for local communities to actually pierce that veil of ignorance that you correctly point out. Right, CG then tried to extend on this by saying, at least we understand the nuances of local problems. First of all, this is not mutually exclusive. I again don't understand why there's so much massive mischaracterizations of going on here. Global movements can walk the ground and be like, look, the Inuit community is facing melting polar ice caps, and then plaster instrumentalized images on this on like Facebook, on like Twitter, and then gain virality in social media. But second of all, we point out that going global is actually the way in which we find a solution. Note, for example, the Indonesian government that has currently no expertise to overcome the problem of slash and burn, that we have sharing technology under our side. Crucially, going local under their side is basically sine doche for reifying the interests of powerful lobby groups, developing nations who can abscond their responsibility and that continue to exercise their disproportionate influence of climate change agenda. CAO's extension is therefore sine doche for doing absolute check. And Gov Whip concedes to this when he says we should only care about people in the present. Guys, more people are going to die on your side. I suggest that's a harm you will want to swallow. And if we don't stop temperature rising, as what Gov asserts, then the human race will cease to exist in about 100 years. So it is important that we be aspirational about our solutions, but more than just being aspirational, I've just proved to you why we get currency on our side. Last of all, why was its second extension about decolonizing the Anthropocene fundamentally round-winning? We point out that this received very little response from CG, and the reason why this is important is because it allows us to understand why we should partition global responsibilities on climate change in a more equitable manner. The status quo is one where developing nations gain the brunt of it. We want to decolonize it by pointing out that the Anthropocene started with Columbus and colonization, and therefore get more equitable solutions, such as a shared Paris Climate Accord that for the first time in a century finally partitions responsibility equally. For all these reasons, incredibly proud stand on CO.
Hear, hear. Okay, thanks everyone for an excellent debate, and invite you all to Yeah, leave briefly and we'll get back to you as soon as possible.
Thanks
everyone.
everybody. Bye.
Okay, I just want to make sure that the live stream isn't still going.
Yeah, I can pull up the Facebook and just see if it's on there.
I also don't know if it's supposed to start while the live stream is still in here, so I'm also wondering about that.
Yeah, I don't feel comfortable deliberating while
Neither do
there's.
I. So I'm not going to start my timer until I get an indication on that one way or another.
I'll tag Orcon.
Let me know if you go on the Facebook what you find, because I'm not getting a response from my message.